characteristics of Christ. I think the question really begs to be explained in terms of how people experienced him and saw him. They are our eyewitnesses, one way or another. And I start with John, who was the author of John's Gospel. Whoever that was, and we don't know who it was, it almost certainly wasn't John of James and John. I describe him as a young man. I describe him as somebody who knew Jerusalem and who was a part of Jerusalem, lived there, and so on. And was with Jesus from the very earliest times, and met him down by the Jordan River along with other disciples. But the characters who met Jesus along the way are people who were not necessarily the ones that you would most often think of as being material for disciples of anyone. I mean, Peter, for example. In the story of Peter, we see him so distressed at betraying Jesus that maybe for the rest of his life he was trying to prove his loyalty to Christ. And in the end, the story of Peter's death, where he is escaping from Rome at the beginnings of the Neronic persecutions, and he meets the Christ, Peter says to him, "Where are you going?" "Quo vadis?" And Jesus says, "To be crucified again." And Peter turns around and goes back to Rome, to his death, to his crucifixion. So here we have Peter, the story of Peter, whose love for this man Jesus is so profound that he is scarred by his own weakness at a moment when he was caught off guard. Now, is that not human? Isn't that understandable? Isn't it kind of lovely? But behind it is his love for this person of Christ. You think of Mary Magdalene. Now, I know a lot has been made of Mary Magdalene's relationship with Jesus, but when I began to write her story, I was profoundly affected by the story of her despair at the crucifixion and her being there on Sunday morning hours before daylight. And I asked myself why. And I asked myself what kind of anxiety, what kind of fears was she responding to when she acknowledges Jesus' presence and says, if you've taken away my Lord, tell me and I will take him away and I'll look after it. That's her response. Why? What is this about? It was because Mary, I think, this is what I think because Mary saw in the Christ her salvation as a person. Now, I'm not talking about heaven or anything like that. I'm talking about a person who experienced for the first time the wholeness of herself in the face of horrendous abuse, which had taken away her sense of hope and had taken away her sense of a person. This we see in battered women. And in the story of Mary Magdalene, we have one reference that I think makes sense of all of this. Jesus cast out 7 demons from her. Wow, 7 demons. What does that mean? But we do know that one of the symptoms that we sometimes encounter with women who have been severely abused over a long period of time, both physically and psychologically, is multiple personality disorder, where what we experience in them is splitting, where they create shards of their own personality and they're able to migrate between them to keep ahead of the abuser and hide in secret behind facades. And people say, huh, they're crazy. And I think Mary Magdalene was an abused woman, and Christ gave wholeness to her, brought her into being again. That is why she could not allow the Christ to disappear without her caring. Then you have his mother. The more that the little bits and pieces we see of Mary, we see a person who was incredibly centered herself. Very capable, very caring. You see people like the people whom he healed, the lepers and so on. His response to them was, of course I want to heal you. His compassion flowed. It was almost as if he couldn't help himself. That was the nature of the man that we see as Christ. And it's reflected in these people's response to him. I think of the lepers, I think of the blind man, I think of so many others. I think of the people who became opponents of his, even the Pharisees. One of them said, well, you know, you really make sense. That was when in his answer to them he said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. And the person is, makes sense. He has spoken well. And so he was able to precipitate in other people a response that was beyond their own position. But then there were those who wanted him dead. Caiaphas, the priesthood of the temple. And it's that issue that I think was behind the malice that we encountered and that led to his death. And it wasn't a one-week thing. It was a period. It was over a period of time that desire to have him dead grew. And it grew because they couldn't afford to let him live, because what he was doing was destroying the reason for the temple, the validity of sacrifice of those animals. He was introducing a new way to God, authoritatively saying, this is the way to God. This is the new temple that I am building. And to the woman at the well, he says, we will all be worshipping in spirit and in truth. The water that I shall give you is a well of water welling up in you to eternal life. Those are the elements that constantly mobilize and motivate the people around him, and they are surprised by them. And in some ways, their response is witness to what there is there present in Jesus' personality.